Modern football has always been comfortable with certainty. A striker is expected to live in one place, the edge of the last line, waiting for the final touch, defined by the simplest metric in the game, goals. Everything about the role is supposed to be linear: receive, finish, repeat. Even systems built on fluidity still quietly rely on that final point of clarity, the one player who converts structure into outcome. But in that logic, Roberto Firmino never quite made sense. He was positioned as a striker, yet constantly moved away from the space a striker is meant to occupy. He dropped into midfield lines, linked play instead of finishing it, and often appeared more involved in the build-up than in the final act. Nothing about it looked accidental, and nothing about it looked like inefficiency either, because the more he left the box, the more the team around him began to function as a complete structure, which creates a quiet contradiction at the center of his career. If a striker's absence from scoring zones improves the system's balance, then what exactly defines the role itself? Firmino doesn't challenge the idea of finishing, he displaces it, and in doing so he forces a more uncomfortable question onto the game: whether the striker was ever meant to be the final step or just the most visible one. He didn't grow up inside a system that told him where to stand. In the streets of Maceo, football didn't come with positions. It came with pressure, tight spaces, uneven surfaces, bodies closing in from every angle. There was no time to hold shape, no instruction to remain disciplined. You either adapted in motion or you lost the ball. And over time, that environment shaped something specific in Roberto Firmino, not a sense of positioning, but a sense of escape. He learned to move before danger arrived, to drift into spaces others weren't watching, to make decisions before the structure around him could settle. That kind of instinct doesn't disappear when structure is introduced. It resists it. As Firmino moved into organized football, the game began asking him for clarity. Hold your position, define your role, simplify your decisions. But his game had already developed in the opposite direction. Instead of occupying space, he interpreted it. Instead of waiting for the ball, he moved to reshape the moment before it happened. What looked like inconsistency on the surface was actually something more deliberate underneath. He wasn't avoiding structure, he just wasn't relying on it. And that's where the first tension begins to form. Because players like this don't fail immediately, they confuse first. Coaches don't see a weakness, they see something they can't quite define. A forward who doesn't stay high, a midfielder who doesn't hold shape, a connector who doesn't fully belong to either phase. It doesn't break the system, but it doesn't settle into it either. And that ambiguity follows him as his career moves forward, not as a limitation, but as something unresolved. Because when a player never fully learns to stay in one place, the game eventually has to decide what to do with him. Either force him into a role, or allow him to change it entirely. At TSG Hoffenheim, the structure was clear long before Roberto Firmino arrived. Vertical transitions, defined lanes, roles that fed into each other with purpose. The expectation for an attacking player was simple: occupy your zone, connect the phases, arrive where you're needed. But Firmino didn't settle into any one of those responsibilities. He drifted between them, sometimes receiving deep, almost as a midfielder, sometimes appearing higher, but never fixed long enough to be treated like a striker. From a distance, it looked like inconsistency. Up close, it was something else entirely. He was reading the game before committing to it. That's what made him difficult to categorize. He wasn't breaking the system, but he wasn't reinforcing it either. When Hoffenheim built through midfield, he would drop in to create an extra passing angle, turning under pressure and releasing the ball before it could collapse on him. When the play advanced, he didn't always arrive as the final option. He hovered just behind it, linking rather than finishing. It created smoother transitions, cleaner circulation, but it left one question unanswered. If he's not the one ending attacks, then what exactly is his role within them? And that uncertainty never fully resolved, it just followed him. Because what looked like a missing piece was actually a different function entirely. Firmino wasn't avoiding responsibility in the final third, he was redistributing it across the structure. But without a clear label, that idea remained incomplete. until the moment his movements stopped being interpreted as a flaw and started being used as the foundation of a system. That shift begins when he arrives at Liverpool FC under Jurgen Klopp, not as a finished striker, but as something still undefined, waiting to be under. By the time Roberto Firmino became the central reference point at Liverpool FC, the question wasn't whether he could behave like a striker, it was whether the team still needed one in the traditional sense. Against Arsenal, the expectation was familiar. Central defenders hold their line, track the striker, protect the space in front of goal. The structure assumes one thing, that the striker will stay within reach. But from the opening phases, that assumption begins to fail. Firmino doesn't fix himself to the last line. He drops, drifts, reappears in pockets that don't belong to his position. And in those small movements, the defensive logic starts to stretch. In one sequence, he receives not between the center backs, but in front of them, just far enough to avoid immediate pressure. A defender steps forward, uncertain whether to engage or hold the line. That single hesitation is enough, because the moment the line reacts to him, it stops protecting the space behind it. Mohamed Salah moves into that gap, Sadio Mane adjusts his run, and suddenly the structure that was built to contain a striker is responding to something else entirely. Firmino hasn't attacked the defense, he's redirected it. The pattern repeats, not as improvisation, but as design. Each time he leaves the striker zone, the same question is forced onto the defenders. Follow him and break the line, or ignore him and lose control of the center. There isn't a correct answer, only consequences. And that's where his role becomes clear. He isn't the end of the attack, he's the mechanism that decides how the attack unfolds. The space he vacates becomes as important as the space he occupies, and then the contradiction completes itself. He scores, not from static positioning or predictable movement, but from the very chaos he helps create. A hat trick in a role that isn't supposed to produce one. And that's the moment the title stops being a description and becomes an explanation. He wasn't underperforming as a striker, he was redefining the role entirely. This is what it means to be the striker who wasn't a striker. Not absent from the game, but present in a way the position was never designed to contain. What followed wasn't an adjustment, it was alignment. The front three at Liverpool FC didn't function as separate roles. They operated as a single mechanism. And at its center was Roberto Firmino. Not because he scored the most, but because he decided how everything connected. When he dropped, Mohamed Salah moved inside the space he left. When he pulled defenders out, Sadio Mane attacked the gap that appeared. It looked like freedom on the surface, but underneath it was coordinated. His movement wasn't random, it was instructional. It told the system where to go next. Under Jurgen Klopp, that influence extended beyond possession. Firmino became the first point of pressure, not just in distance, but in intention. The press didn't begin when Liverpool lost the ball. It began with his positioning before they lost it. He angled his runs to force play into specific areas, closed passing lanes before they were used, and triggered movement behind him without needing to signal it. Defenders weren't just reacting to pressure, they were reacting to direction. And that subtle control made the system feel faster than it actually was. Over time, that kind of presence changes how a team is experienced, not just how it plays. Teammates stop interpreting his movement, they trust it. The crowd doesn't measure his influence in goals, they feel it in control. Even when he isn't finishing attacks, he's inside them, shaping the sequence before it reaches its final moment. It's why his importance becomes difficult to isolate. Remove him, and nothing collapses instantly, but everything loses clarity. The connections weaken, the timing slips, the structure becomes slightly less certain, and yet the outcomes remain undeniable. A Champions League title, a league title, sustained dominance across seasons, achievements often credited to the collective, but quietly dependent on a role that never fully appeared on the surface. Firmino didn't redefine the system by overpowering it. He became essential by making everything around him function more precisely, not as the focal point of the attack, but as the reason it worked at all. What Firmino leaves behind isn't a template. It's a shift in what teams look for when they build attacks. The striker is no longer just the final reference point. waiting for the decisive touch. He becomes part of the construction itself, responsible not only for finishing moves, but for shaping them before they exist. Roberto Firmino didn't introduce that idea alone, but he made it visible in its most complete form. A forward who could press, connect, manipulate space, and still arrive at the right moment, not because he stayed in position, but because he understood when to leave it. That change forces a deeper adjustment in how the game is read. Defenders can no longer rely on fixed references, midfielders can't assume control of central zones, and attacking structures stop revolving around a single endpoint. Instead, responsibility becomes shared, fluid, constantly shifting based on movement rather than position. And in that environment, the striker is no longer defined by goals alone, but by how much of the game he can influence without the ball ever reaching him. It's why Firmino's role feels difficult to replicate. Not because others can't move the same way, but because the understanding behind those movements isn't easily taught. Timing, awareness, the ability to sense when to draw pressure and when to release it, those are decisions made in moments, not instructions followed over time. He didn't just occupy space, he altered how space was used around him. And once that becomes the standard, the role itself begins to dissolve into something less rigid, more interpretive. So he wasn't a striker in the traditional sense, not because he lacked the qualities, but because he expanded the role beyond them. He didn't remove the need for a number 9. He changed what the number 9 was responsible for. And in doing so, he left behind something that doesn't always appear in highlights or statistics, but shows up in the structure of the modern game itself. The idea that influence doesn't have to be visible to be decisive.